All right, Bill, thank you. And Todd and David and Kent, thank you. Wow. So how many of you have been enjoying this series, daring greatly in the home study groups especially? Yeah, some of you. How many of you are struggling with it? This is some deep stuff, some honest people. Thank you. This is some deep stuff we are doing. Moving into this place of shifting our consciousness from that hard shell exterior we have been immersed in for so long in our culture to becoming vulnerable. Today we're going to talk about some different levels of consciousness, some different shields that we use to protect us. Brene Brown writes about Viking or victim consciousness. What are Viking and victim consciousness? Well, they are forms of consciousness that we use to protect ourselves. They are both shields to protect us from the events or the perceived events of life, to protect us from the actions of others towards us and us towards them. Victim consciousness, we see ourselves as losers, someone who's always being taken advantage of. Anybody ever been there? I have. I'm honest enough to admit it. On the other hand, we could be Vikings. Vikings, where we see danger everywhere around us, danger of being victimized, and we do our best to dominate, to stay in control, to exert power over others, and definitely never, ever, ever, ever show vulnerability. In Western culture, that has been the model for so many years. Many of us, I think men were immersed in it, especially in my generation, what we call that John Wayne consciousness. But it permeates both sexes. And it's modeled on that idea of being strong, standing on your own 2 feet, never admitting pain or need, and certainly never being vulnerable. As we have moved into the postmodern era, though, we're realizing that these models, both for men and women, must change. The idea of there being winners and losers, kill or be killed, strong or weak, leaders or followers, successes or failures, are evolving. These concepts no longer are fitting into the consciousness of the emerging Homo sapiens. That's the people who come from the heart rather than the head. And we're seeing it more and more and more in the younger generations. Survival and winning may be indicators of success in the old paradigm, but they are not relevant in the new one. And they must evolve then. So let's ask ourselves. Our title for this lesson today is Redefining Success. What is success? Well, the Viking idea of success is defeat the enemy at all costs. But in order to do that, we have to say, okay, who or what is the enemy? And the definition is anything or anyone that threatens the status quo. We've had this consciousness that change is not good. We've always done it this way. Look at what is happening in just the United States alone. There's a vast energy of shifting happen. And there's a lot of fear as well. We can't change. That would be too foreign, too uncomfortable for me. And that's understandable because that's the energy we have lived in for so long, for thousands of years. That energy of we've always done it this way. And that works for us when we're in that consciousness, but only for us. And that has been considered okay. How does it affect even business? In Viking business, there's this idea of destroy the competition. It's not about serving the customer. Anybody go to Walmart lately? They don't even have cashiers anymore. You got to do it yourself. And God forbid you take a break in their break room. I mean, come on, we're doing all the work. The only thing left is unload the trucks. Might as well. Viking business, don't serve the customer. It may show up as, let's make more money than anybody else or any other company. Let's drive them out of business. Let's have more beautiful buildings, and let's make our stockholders happy. How does it show up in personal experiences? Viking consciousness can be about overcoming trauma by inflicting greater trauma on the other. Look at what's going on in the Middle East and Ukraine. For centuries in the Middle East, one side attacks the other and the other side attacks the other, which creates trauma. So how do we handle the trauma? We inflict more trauma on the other side, and it goes back and forth over and over and over again. Destroying anything that is remotely perceived as threatening has been the model. The drawback to that is, once the threat is removed, Viking consciousness has to look for a new threat or go into surviving mode, which means stagnation. The challenge with that is that in that Viking consciousness, there can be no creativity, because creativity threatens the status quo. Thus, a Viking conscious person or society ultimately has to die from within. And then there's victim mentality. What is victim mentality success? Well, there really isn't any success in that mentality, just like there's really no success in the Viking mentality. But it's the only way I can get my needs met is to be a victim. And so what have we created through the ages? We have created a way of thinking that says, if I'm a victim, the only way I can get out of that is to become a Viking. Well, then we defeat the Vikings and they become the victims. Nothing against anybody who is of Norse descent. They weren't Vikings, by the way, they were Norsemen. Viking was a word that meant to go to war. What about trauma? How does that come into play? There are people who survive trauma, be it combat, domestic violence, sexual or physical trauma, neglect, poverty, prejudice, fear. Some grow despite it, and some do not. And the answer, according to Brené Brown, the reason some people can grow despite that is what we call shame resilience. Those who have the resilience cultivate 4 steps of healing. First, recognize shame and understand its triggers. Recognize it. We've all lived with it. If you grew up in the culture that I grew up in, which was pretty much everybody in this room, I bet, shame was a tool that was used to get us to conform. And it goes back all the way back before even Jesus' time. But the way we change it is we recognize it and understand its triggers. We practice critical awareness. Spiritual awareness helps too. That's going to come in a few minutes. We ask ourselves, what are the messages that are driving our shame? First, we have to admit that we have it. We have to become, what's the word? Vulnerable. And we have to admit, yeah, we have it. So what are the messages that are driving that? The messages are what we see ourselves as, or what we think we are supposed to be, and how we think somebody else is supposed to behave, or need, or want. We have these little boxes that those things fit into. We have to recognize that as the first step and say, oh, it's time to unpack those boxes. So the next thing is to share our stories. Hopefully that is some of what you are doing in your home study groups, in that small group where it's safe to share your stories. Speak about the things that have felt shameful. Talk about how you feel. And here's one we're not good at in our culture. Ask for what you need. You know, one of the early interpretations in the early church of asking in the name of Jesus was asking for what you need. And originally it was asking your fellow worshipers. And then it became, you can only ask God. And then it became, you can only ask God through a priest. But what Jesus was talking about when he said, ask in my name, pray in my name, was pray from that place of consciousness, of recognizing what it is you need as an individual, what it is we need as a people. Talk about how you feel. You know, we see in ministry all the time, one of the big roadblocks to that, and I have done it too, where somebody comes to me for healing, for prayer, and they say, well, I can't do that. They want counseling and support. But there's that within us that wants things to remain the same, that Viking consciousness. Because to grow means stepping out of our comfort zones. We cannot remain the way we are, the way we have been. What causes that? What has caused that is a lack of what we call hope. There's no belief in the idea that there can be a different way. Brene Brown says the greatest dare we will ever take is to dare to hope. To dare to hope that there is something beyond our current experience, our current consciousness. And yet there's even a problem with the word hope. I looked up hope. If you know me, you know that's something I like to do. It comes from 8th century German, and it meant originally to leap in expectation. Wow, how many of us leap in expectation that there could be something better? That we could live a more full expression of life. Anybody out there? Is anybody out there? Okay, just checking. The problem with what we have done with the word hope, it's become almost the same as wishing. We've forgotten that growth can never occur in the past. It can only occur when? Now. It cannot occur in what has not been living. Perhaps the greatest challenge we have to face is to rethink what that word hope means to us. Russell Lake, the great author, wrote this: hope and wish are kindred words now. Both are passive, inert, with an interweaving of fear. Hoping, though, is not the way of the mind. The mind is naturally decisive, and it is firm, and it knows only accomplishment. Think about that. Your mind is a decisive organ. Once we decide that we want to change, that we can change, that we are ready to change, that we have a vision of what that looks like, it's a done deal in the mind, unless we go back into victim or Viking consciousness. Because that consciousness destroys the knowing and puts us into the postmodern understanding of the word hope. Hope prohibits decisive action. Think about that. Those are tough words. Brene Brown wrote, a hope for future manifestation is a demand for present inaction. Very tough words. You know, the Buddhists have a different take on the word hope, a different understanding of that. You may have heard that to be Buddhist means to practice hopelessness, but it's not what you think. The word they use for hope is nirose, and it means the absence of wishing. Putting it into modern language from the words of the Buddha, ordinary people live with hope. This hope is based on desire, wanting various things or a particular way or a particular outcome, and hoping to obtain it. This hope sustains life when someone is disappointed or feels hopeless due to not getting what is wished for, or due to the unattainability of an object. Then that person is considered to have misfortune. But when someone is gratified by obtaining what is wanted or something desired, or something that appears to be within reach, that person is considered to be fortunate. However, a hopeful person still has an expectation or an anticipation of the possibility of being disappointed. Think about that. When we say, I hope this happens, we're leaving a door open for the possibility of disappointment. The Buddha said, this is fear, a form of suffering. An awakened person resembles someone who has no hope, but there is an important distinction. The awakened person does not long for health or success. They know that these are already true in nature. Thus, there is nothing to be wished for, only to be accepted. Sounds like unity teachings, doesn't it? We are healthy and whole. We are peace-filled. We are loving. We are abundantly supplied. And yet, for most of human history, that's always been something we have to attain or get or hope it will come to us. But the Buddha and Jesus and Brene Brown and Charles and Myrtle Fillmore and every great teacher the world has ever known has said, it's here, you're in it. Jesus said, where is the kingdom of heaven? You're in it. Right here, right now. It's all around you. Everything you could ever need, including peace. So how do we attain that? How are we going to change the lens of victim and Viking consciousness and the lenses of hope and wish to the lens of acceptance? The way we do that is to become vulnerable. Now let's talk about that word, vulnerable. How many of you struggle with that word? I'm a Taurus. I'm a child of the generation where you cannot be vulnerable. We're tough. We're men, manly men. Can't be vulnerable. Tauruses in particular are not known for vulnerability. But it was when I came to understand the true meaning of the word from a different perspective that I began to be able to make that shift. The word vulnerability comes from an Old Norse word. It comes from the same root as Valhalla or Valhalla. And we have another word that comes from that root, valor. And literally the word in Norse meant to cut open. Yuck. In Old Norse belief, the only way one could enter Valhalla was to be cut open to let the poisons out. To be wounded in battle. Why? Because you cannot enter heaven with the poison within you. Jesus demonstrated that by demonstrating that in order to enter that higher consciousness, the flesh body has to be destroyed. The ego consciousness that holds the poison, not the ego itself, but the part of it that holds the thoughts, the ideas, the understandings that poison us, that prevent us from growing. So metaphysically, Valhalla is heaven consciousness. It's that consciousness of enlightenment, of freedom. But you must first cut out shame. You have to rid the lesser consciousness in order to rise to the higher consciousness. Brene Brown's work then is nothing less or more than a modern understanding of the mystical beliefs of the ancient peoples, of the teachings of Jesus and the Buddha and so many others. And we are here now to experience that, to learn how to grow. And to grow means we have to dare something great, something different. Dare to be something every message we have lived with tries to tell us not to be. And the important thing to remember is we cannot do it alone. Your trauma is my trauma, and my trauma is your trauma. Your healing is my healing, and my healing is your healing. That's what Jesus meant when he said, if I am lifted up, I draw all others to me. What he was saying is, don't put me on a pedestal. That's not what he was saying. He was saying, when I rise in consciousness, everyone around me rises in consciousness. And guess what? When you rise in consciousness, everyone around you rises in consciousness. That's why in the meditation I said, when we are praying for peace in the Ukraine, the Middle East, the international district, wherever, we have to stop this energy of blame and shame and finger pointing and deciding who's right and who's wrong. And instead, get into that consciousness of oneness, of healing. Our healing, someone else's healing. Our peace, someone else's peace. Connection is how we do it. We are more connected than we realize. And connection is how we heal. It's how we heal ourselves. It's how we heal our country. It's how we heal our culture. It's how we heal our world. And we do it by listening to one another, by becoming vulnerable and sharing our stories. It means discovering what we have in common. And we all have a point where we can build a connection. You may have heard me tell the story about a friend of mine in Arkansas who was at a rally against gun violence. Not against guns, against gun violence. And I'm going to tell you the story in her words. She was at this rally, and across the street from them was another rally. They were on opposite sides of one another. And she writes, one of the people attending was sitting on a bench with a box of donuts, when a young man from the other side came over, infiltrated their group, and tried to pick a fight. She describes it this way. That young man was on the other side of the issue and was looking to fight a bit, I believe, with me. And I kept silently praying as he approached because I'm not known for being a quiet spirit. Something inside made me decide to just love this guy. I was holding a box of donuts that someone had given me, and the only word I could think of to come out of my mouth when he walked up to me was, "You want a donut?" He smiled and said, "Yes." And for that moment, all was right with the world. Neither one of us changed the other mind that day, but for that moment, there was a bridge between us. We did not see each other as antagonists, simply strangers sharing donuts. There is a magic that happens when we decide that who we are and what we have been through matters. And then we begin to realize that's true for others. And we begin to look for those points of connection. And it may be simple as offering a donut. Because then we tell our stories. And in those stories, we find that being vulnerability is about losing our skin, our armor, and letting our guts hang out. Sorry about that metaphor. And in doing that, we discover that we are not so different after all. And in coming into oneness with each other, that is what success is really about. Whoa, Spirit's messing with me today. Not everyone will do it. Not everyone will do it. And that's important to understand as well. We're all growing at our own pace and our own levels of consciousness. Brene Brown advises us, don't try to win over the haters. And she's a little rough in this. She says, you are not the jackass whisperer. Jesus said almost the same thing when he said, let the dead bury the dead. What did he mean by that? He was saying, let those who are not yet awake be. It's okay. Find the ones who you can share your stories with, who you can be vulnerable with, and begin to work where you are. Don't try to force somebody else to fit your model. That's Viking consciousness. Be gentle with one another. Let the dead bury the dead. Because life is for the living and for those who dare greatly. Dare greatly. Thank you.